The man who didn't belong. Michael stood in the lobby of the Opal Grand, the weight of judgment pressing against him like an unrelenting tide. Dismissed, doubted, and confronted. Yet calm, he held his ground. Then from the pocket of his leather jacket, he produced a badge that silenced the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and eyes widened as realization dawned. The man they deemed out of place owned the place. "Respect isn't conditional," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "It's the foundation of everything we stand for. Or at least, it should be." The storm of bias was laid bare, leaving everyone to grapple with their assumptions. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another gripping story. As the tense standoff unfolded, Tom felt frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Internally, he wrestled with the discomfort he wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, admit aloud. It wasn't just about the misunderstanding over the reservation or the escalating scene in the lobby. For Tom, Michael's simple attire and unassuming demeanor didn't align with the image of a guest who belonged at the Opal Grand Hotel. "He doesn't belong here," Tom told himself, though the thought felt hollow even as he clung to it. Growing up in a suburban neighborhood where wealth and appearances dictated worth, Tom had been conditioned to associate success with tailored suits, polished shoes, and expensive watches. Anything outside that narrow frame, in his mind, was suspect. This ingrained bias shaped how he saw Michael, not as a potential guest, but as an inconvenience to be managed and dismissed. The leather jacket, the worn jeans, the relaxed posture, it all seemed to scream, wrong place, wrong person. Beneath his judgment, though, was fear. Fear of disorder, fear of being challenged, fear of being wrong. And that fear made his hostility sharper, his actions more rigid. People like that always push boundaries, Tom thought, standing stiffly behind the desk. Though the words weren't spoken aloud, they echoed in his mind, fueling his tone and demeanor. He didn't know Michael's story, nor did he care to ask. His prejudice filled the gaps where curiosity might have been. Meanwhile, Anna, who had initially sided with Tom's dismissive stance, began to question her own reactions. At first, she had nodded along, offering a quiet comment in support of Tom's assumptions. It was easier to agree, easier to follow the lead of someone as vocal and confident as Tom than to challenge him. But now, standing just a few feet away, she couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at her. Something about Michael's calm demeanor clashed too starkly with Tom's escalating hostility. While Tom's sneer deepened and his voice grew sharper, Michael remained composed. Steady, measured, unshaken. It was unsettling and thought-provoking. What if we're wrong? Anna wondered, her gaze shifting uneasily to the security guards, who hovered nearby, their uncertainty evident in their hesitant movements. The stakes were rising. If Tom's assumptions about Michael were misplaced, the consequences could ripple far beyond this moment. A public confrontation, especially one captured on video, could tarnish the hotel's reputation. Worse, it could expose a failure to uphold the very principles of hospitality they were meant to represent. Anna swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting with the papers she had been pretending to organize. She glanced at Tom, whose smirk had returned, emboldened by the presence of the security guards. Her discomfort deepened as she realized that he wasn't entertaining even the slightest possibility of error. Tom's certainty, fueled by bias, left no room for self-reflection. But Anna wasn't so sure. Her thoughts spiraled. What if this man is someone important? What if this is a test? Stories she'd heard swirled in her mind. Executives posing as ordinary guests to evaluate staff, undercover reviews designed to catch employees off guard. The idea wasn't far-fetched, and the weight of that possibility pressed heavily on her chest. Meanwhile, Tom continued to dig himself deeper into his assumptions, oblivious to Anna's inner turmoil. Every calm glance Michael directed his way, every measured word he spoke, felt like an affront to Tom's authority. and Tom didn't like feeling challenged, especially not by someone he had already dismissed as out of place. The murmurs from the guests grew louder, a quiet but growing chorus of speculation and judgment. Tom seemed impervious to it, but Anna felt every gaze, every whispered comment. The room was turning, and the scrutiny was no longer focused solely on Michael. I should say something, Anna thought, her stomach twisting with anxiety. But every time she opened her mouth, the words faltered. Doubt held her back. What if I'm wrong, she worried. What if siding with Michael, or even suggesting we reconsider, makes me look weak or disloyal? Her hesitation contrasted starkly with Tom's unshakable conviction. Where Anna saw shades of gray, Tom saw only black and white. In his mind, there was no room for doubt, no need for further investigation. He was certain he was right. But certainty, as Anna realized, wasn't the same as truth, and in that moment she began to understand the weight of her silence. End of section 1. The security guards shifted awkwardly, their body language betraying their own uncertainty. One of them glanced toward Michael, then back at Tom, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Is there really no reservation under his name? Anna finally asked, her voice hesitant but loud enough to cut through the tension. It was a small step, but it broke the stagnant atmosphere, if only briefly. Tom's head snapped toward her, irritation flashing in his eyes. I told you, I checked, he snapped. There's nothing there. But Anna wasn't convinced anymore. She could see the cracks forming, not just in Tom's composure, but in the very foundation of his assumptions. For the first time, she realized she might have the power to widen those cracks and let the truth seep through. Michael's persistence, calm and measured, was like a steady wind against the fragile house of cards Tom had built. The tension in the lobby thickened, palpable in every glance and whispered comment from the growing crowd of onlookers. Michael understood that moments like these often revealed more about the people involved than about the situation itself. Now, the Opal Grand's employees stood on the edge of a precipice, whether they recognized it or not. Still standing behind her desk, Anna tried to diffuse the situation in her own way, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. Maybe we should call security, she said, her words tinged with sarcasm as she attempted to mask her discomfort. The remark hung awkwardly in the air, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. An older man seated near the lobby's fireplace leaned over to his companion and whispered, "What's going on over there?" His voice carried just enough to add another layer of tension. Across the room, a young woman angled her phone slightly, her thumb tapping to begin recording. Her expression was neutral, but her actions signaled a growing awareness that something significant was unfolding. Michael noticed everything: the whispers, the discreetly raised phone, the shifting energy in the room. He had seen similar scenarios before, in boardrooms and on factory floors. But this was different. This wasn't just a test of policy or leadership. It was a test of values, of dignity, of how people chose to wield power when they thought no one important was watching, or when they assumed those watching wouldn't care. Tom, oblivious to the shifting dynamics around him, leaned further into his role as the enforcer of unwritten rules. "Sir," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "if you don't have a reservation, you can't stay here. It's that simple." His words were crisp, deliberate, designed to reassert his authority in a situation that was slipping through his fingers. Michael met Tom's gaze, unwavering. "And I've told you," he replied, his voice steady, "that my reservation is in your system. I'd like you to check again." The simplicity of Michael's request only seemed to frustrate Tom further. He turned to one of the security guards who had stepped closer, their presence looming over the exchange. "This guest is refusing to cooperate," Tom said, pointing at Michael as though delivering a verdict. "Please escort him out." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking between Tom and Michael. Though he had been called in as muscle, he wasn't blind to the nuances of the situation. Michael's calm demeanor didn't align with the narrative Tom was trying to construct. And then there was the crowd. Guests actively watching now, their murmurs creating an undercurrent of unease. Anna shifted uncomfortably, her internal conflict evident in the way she fidgeted with the edge of the desk. She wasn't sure what compelled her to speak, but the words came anyway, unsteady yet audible. Maybe we should just check again. To be sure. Tom turned on her, his frustration snapping like a taut rubber band. I did check, he said, his voice sharp enough to draw more attention from the crowd. There's nothing there. Anna shrank back slightly, but Michael caught the flicker of defiance in her expression. It was small, but it was there, a seed of doubt that hadn't existed before. Across the room, a guest whispered just loud enough to be heard. Why don't they just check again? What's the harm? The comment rippled through the air, adding to the quiet pressure building around Tom and Anna. Later, Tom said, Michael understood what this moment had become. A turning point. It was no longer just about him. It was about everyone watching. What they would take away from this scene, what they would recount to friends and family later. He wasn't merely a man insisting on his reservation. He was a mirror, reflecting the values, or the lack thereof, of everyone involved in that lobby. The second security guard, less composed than the first, cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we should, check one more time, just to be sure. His suggestion was aimed at Tom, but the subtle nod he directed toward Michael didn't go unnoticed. Tom bristled, his grip on the situation slipping with each passing moment. There's no point, he said, his voice rising slightly. We don't cater to people who... He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that he was dangerously close to exposing his bias outright. Michael took a measured step forward, deliberate yet non-threatening. The security guards instinctively stiffened, but Michael's calm voice cut through the tension. Let me make this clear, he said, addressing Tom while ensuring his words carried to the room. I've been nothing but patient and respectful. All I've asked is that you verify my reservation. If you refuse, perhaps your manager can... His quiet authority sent a ripple through the lobby. A few guests murmured in agreement, and Anna, emboldened by Michael's composure, finally found her voice. Maybe we should call the manager, she said softly, though her words carried enough weight to command attention. Tom hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. The storm he had created was no longer confined to the desk. It had spread throughout the lobby. The guests were no longer passive observers. They had become participants in the unfolding drama. Sensing the shift, Michael stayed steady. He knew this storm would break, and when it did, the truth would be laid bare for all to see. The security guards, towering and imposing, stepped forward, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere in the room. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned to them. The lead guard, a burly man with a stern expression, spoke first. Let's not make this difficult, he said firmly. His tone meant to signal that the situation was no longer under the control of the front desk. Michael didn't flinch, his posture calm and unyielding as the guards approached. He caught the unease radiating from Anna, and even Tom seemed to falter before regaining a semblance of composure. The faint smirk on Tom's face betrayed his relief, as though he believed the guard's presence had solidified his authority. As the lead guard took another step forward, Michael raised a hand, not in surrender, but in deliberate control. His voice, calm yet commanding, sliced through the charged silence. Touch me, and you'll regret it. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for a moment the entire lobby seemed frozen in time. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, their initial confidence shaken. Michael's tone held no aggression, no desperation, only quiet authority that made it clear he wasn't bluffing. The lead guard hesitated, his hand hovering near his belt. Sir, he said, cautiously, his voice softer now, we don't want any trouble. Just step outside and we can resolve this peacefully. Michael didn't budge, his steady gaze locked onto the guards, unwavering. I'm not leaving, he said firmly. Unless you've been given direct orders to remove me without cause, I suggest you take a step back and reassess the situation." Anna's discomfort was palpable. Her eyes darted between the guards, Tom and Michael, silently willing someone to de-escalate. Tom, meanwhile, crossed his arms, attempting to appear confident. However, the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his growing unease. The scene was no longer unfolding as he had anticipated. In the background, whispers among the guests grew louder. "This doesn't feel right," one man murmured, while another guest, still recording with her phone, whispered, "Who is this guy?" The energy in the room shifted from mere curiosity to suspicion, and the pressure on the staff intensified. The second guard, younger and clearly out of his depth, cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should check with the manager," he suggested, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. Tom snapped his head toward him, irritation flashing in his eyes. "We don't need the manager," he said sharply, though the rising edge in his voice betrayed his crumbling resolve. "This man doesn't have a reservation. He's trespassing." Michael arched an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Trespassing?" he echoed, his tone laced with quiet amusement. "That's a serious accusation. Are you sure you want to make that claim without verifying the facts?" The first guard shifted uncomfortably, the authority in Michael's voice and the growing disapproval among the guests clearly affecting him. He glanced at Tom, hesitation written all over his face. "Maybe we should involve someone higher up," he said reluctantly. Tom's face reddened with frustration. "He's lying," he blurted, his voice louder than intended. The outburst drew even more attention, and Michael noted the ripple of disapproval that passed through the crowd. Anna stepped forward hesitantly, her voice soft but carrying a new resolve. "I think we should call the manager," she said, addressing the guards rather than Tom. "It's the only way to resolve this fairly." Michael's gaze shifted briefly to Anna, and he gave her the faintest nod, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. The lead guard sighed heavily, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "All right," he said gruffly, stepping back. "We'll get the manager." Tom opened his mouth to protest, but the murmurs from the crowd drowned him out. The room had turned against him, and he seemed to realize, too late, that he was no longer in control. As the guards moved toward the office to summon the manager, Michael remained still, his presence commanding but never confrontational. The crowd buzzed with speculation, their eyes fixed on him. The young woman with the phone leaned toward her companion. "This is going viral," she whispered, her gaze never leaving Michael. For Michael, the confrontation wasn't about ego or proving a point. It was about the principle of respect, something the staff of the Opal Grand clearly needed to relearn. He stood tall, waiting for what would come next, fully aware that the storm was far from over. The room buzzed with tension as Michael remained rooted in place, his composed exterior masking the quiet storm within. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was a pattern he had endured far too often. Memories surfaced, sharp and unforgiving, of times he had been judged, dismissed, or overlooked. Each instant stung anew in the charged atmosphere of the hotel lobby. How many more times? The question echoed in his mind. How many more times do I have to prove my worth? He thought of his younger self, fresh out of college, stepping into his first boardroom wearing a suit he could barely afford. Prepared, overqualified even, yet all they saw was his youth and the modest background he couldn't quite hide. The skepticism in their eyes had been a silent rebuke he never forgot. Then came the subtle snubs at country clubs, the averted glances in high-end stores, the polite but dismissive tones of those who assumed he didn't belong. Each moment had been a small cut, and over time, they added up, carving out a deep awareness of the biases that shaped so much of the world. And now, here he was again, in a hotel he owned, being told he didn't belong. The weight of it pressed against his chest, but Michael refused to let it crush him. He took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding himself. His father's words surfaced in his mind, steadying him like an anchor in turbulent waters. You may not change everyone, but you must be the one to start. He filled his lungs with deep, fresh air and prayed that there would be no contact between him and his daughter. It wasn't just a memory, it was a call to action. His father had faced his own battles, building a business in an industry that often seemed determined to exclude him. Yet he carried himself with dignity, teaching Michael by example that respect wasn't something demanded, it was something modeled. The young man slipped a piece of paper into an inside pocket and asked his father for guidance on how to find kindness. Michael's eyes swept over the crowd gathered around him. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity, judgment, and, in some cases, quiet support. This moment had transcended him. It was about the people watching and the lessons they would carry forward. Walking away now would reinforce the idea that appearances defined worth. Staying, holding his ground, might crack open a window of awareness, however small, in the minds of those present. You can't fix what you don't see, his father had told him. But once you see it, don't look away. He looked at the faces of Tom, Anna, the guards, and the onlookers. Each represented a choice, a potential for change. He didn't expect to transform them all, but if even one person left this lobby thinking differently, it would be worth it. Michael's resolve solidified. Anger wasn't going to dictate his actions. This wasn't about humiliation or retaliation. It was about standing for something larger than himself: fairness, respect, and the belief that worth could never be measured by a suit or a watch. Straightening his posture, Michael lifted his chin slightly, his gaze steady as it met the hesitant eyes of one of the security guards. The man's uncertainty was a crack in the facade of authority surrounding the situation. Michael understood how to widen that crack. Not with force, but with clarity and conviction. His father's voice echoed in his mind again, softer this time, but no less powerful. Change starts with the choices you make when it matters most. This was one of those moments, and Michael was ready. Tom's mocking voice pierced through the tension in the lobby, dripping with condescension. "What are you, some kind of lawyer? Go ahead, call someone," he jeered, his smirk widening as if he had claimed victory. It was the usual viral everyman for himself, Afro-punk turned Christian turned racist. Michael, who had maintained his composure through every slight and dismissal, felt something inside him shift. The weight of the moment, the sting of Tom's judgment, and the murmurs from the crowd all crystallized into a sharp, resolute purpose. He was done playing along. Slowly, deliberately, Michael reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out his ID. The room collectively leaned in, curiosity etched on every face as he held it up. The bold, unmistakable letters spelling ONER gleamed under the golden chandelier light. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over the room. For a moment, silence reigned, stunned, absolute silence. The smirk vanished from Tom's face, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. His mouth opened and closed uselessly, the realization hitting him like a freight train. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Michael's gaze remained steady. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm but imbued with undeniable authority. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You judged me based on how I looked, and you decided I didn't belong. Is that how you treat everyone who doesn't meet your expectations?" The question hung in the air, sharp and inescapable. Tom visibly shrank under its weight, his trembling hands revealing the depth of his discomfort. Words failed him as the crowd, once buzzing with quiet speculation, now watched in rapt silence. Anna, standing a few steps away, looked as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Discomfort bloomed into outright guilt as she replayed her complicity in her mind. Her laughter, her agreement, her silence. Now, the sting of her misjudgment was impossible to ignore. Michael turned his gaze to her, his expression softer but no less resolute. "And you," he said, his voice steady. "You knew something wasn't right, but you didn't speak up. Why?" Anna's cheeks flushed as she looked down, unable to meet his eyes. I wasn't sure," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "I thought maybe Tom was right." Michael nodded slowly, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of her honesty. "That hesitation," he said, "is what allows moments like this to happen. Silence is complicity. Remember that." The weight of his words rippled through the room, settling heavily on everyone present. Even the security guards, who had stood stiffly to the side, seemed to reconsider their stance. One of them cleared his throat awkwardly, his gaze darting away as if he wished to disappear. From the crowd, a woman's voice broke the silence. "This is disgraceful," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A place like this, treating people like that." Swift lifted a hand. In spite of herself, Dina noticed the tremble that went with the gesture. It was Isa. Another guest chimed in, emboldened by Michael's revelation. "I can't believe this. If this is how they act, I'm not staying here again." The murmurs grew louder, transforming into a chorus of disapproval. Tom's face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he grasped the gravity of the situation. He hadn't just disrespected a guest. He had insulted the owner of the very hotel he worked for. Michael let the murmurs settle before speaking, his voice calm yet imbued with undeniable authority. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing the entire room. "This is about how people are treated, how quick we are to judge, to assume, to dismiss. That kind of behavior has no place here, not in this hotel and not anywhere." Tom dropped his gaze, his earlier bravado utterly gone. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't mean..." Michael raised a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't about excuses," he said firmly. "It's about what you represent. Every guest who walks through these doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a suit or a leather jacket. That's the standard. That's what this hotel was built on, and that's what you've forgotten." The room fell silent again as Michael's words sank in. Anna stood frozen, guilt etched across her face. Though she looked like she wanted to say something, her shame held her back. The crowd, once curious and passive, now stood as witnesses to a moment of reckoning. Michael slipped his ID back into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Straightening his posture, he let his gaze sweep over the room one last time. The storm had passed, leaving the truth exposed. The question now was what they would do with it. The ripple effect of Michael's revelations swept through the lobby, turning the tide of public opinion against the staff who had dismissed him. Emboldened, the guests found their voices, and their collective outrage began to surface. "This is appalling," said a woman near the concierge desk, her voice carrying across the room. "How can a place like this treat people so poorly?" A businessman in a tailored suit stepped forward, his tone sharp and deliberate. "I travel for work and stay in hotels all the time," he said. "If this is how your staff behaves, I won't be coming back." The murmurs grew into a wave of disapproval. A young couple near the lounge, still recording on their phones, shook their heads. "Unbelievable," the man muttered. "They didn't even bother to check his reservation." But after a few minutes, Deira and the man exchanged glances with each other. Each voice added to the mounting pressure on the staff, particularly Tom, who now seemed desperate to disappear. His earlier confidence was gone, leaving him pale and visibly shaken. An older woman in a designer coat raised her voice from the back of the room. "This isn't just about one man," she said firmly, her tone commanding attention. "It's about how we treat people, all people. What kind of example does this set for the hospitality industry, for any of us?" Her words struck a chord, and the crowd murmured in agreement. The collective indignation had grown beyond Michael's experience, evolving into a broader critique of the culture that enabled such behavior. Behind the desk, the staff exchanged uneasy glances. Anna, visibly shaken, opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, overwhelmed by the mounting criticism. Even the security guards, who had been stoic just moments before, now shifted uncomfortably, their rigid stances softening as the weight of the situation sank in. Michael remained composed, his steady presence a contrast to the growing storm of voices around him. He let the guests' reactions swell, knowing their collective outrage carried a power he couldn't replicate alone. This wasn't just his battle anymore. It had become a shared moment of reckoning. The escalating noise drew the attention of other staff members, who peeked out from side hallways, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The murmurs of dissatisfaction were impossible to ignore, and it was clear that the situation demanded immediate intervention. A middle-aged man with a commanding presence stepped forward from the crowd, gesturing toward the staff. "I suggest someone find the manager immediately," he said firmly. "This is unacceptable, and delaying action only makes it worse." His suggestion ignited a chorus of agreement. "That's right," someone called. "Get the manager." Voices rose in unison, their frustration boiling over into demands for accountability. Faced with the mounting unrest, the staff had no choice but to act. Anna, trembling but determined, stepped away from the desk. I'll go get the manager," she stammered, her voice barely carrying over the crowd. Her retreat was met with murmurs of approval, though the atmosphere remained charged with tension. As Anna disappeared down the hallway, Michael could feel the tide continuing to shift. The voices of the guests amplified the foundation he had laid, turning a single injustice into a collective demand for change. This was no longer just about his experience. It was about holding an entire system accountable. The guests, once passive onlookers, had become active participants in that mission. The tension in the lobby peaked as the manager, Mr. Carter, emerged from the back office. His usual air of confidence was replaced by visible unease. A middle-aged man with carefully combed silver hair and a crisp suit. He appeared weighed down by the charged atmosphere. His pale complexion betrayed his anxiety as he stepped forward, surveying the room with apprehension. "Mr. Walker," he began, his voice faltering before he managed to steady it. "I had no idea you were here." His attempt at regret landed awkwardly, eliciting murmurs of disapproval from the crowd. Some guests folded their arms, others shook their heads, their judgment clear. Mr. Carter's posture, typically one of command, now seemed diminished under the intense scrutiny of the onlookers. Michael stood tall, his composure unbroken. He let the moment stretch, allowing the discomfort in the room to deepen. Finally, he spoke, his words cold and deliberately measured. "If you had known," he said, his tone cutting, "maybe I wouldn't have been treated as a problem that needed removing." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Carter's face flushed with embarrassment, and he fidgeted with the edges of his jacket. I assure you, this isn't how we conduct ourselves here," he stammered, grasping desperately for damage control. "This is a misunderstanding, a terrible one. I deeply apologize for any inconvenience." Michael cut him off, his tone firm but controlled. "This isn't about inconvenience, Mr. Carter. This is about respect. Something your staff seems to lack, not just for me, but for anyone they don't deem worthy." The bluntness of Michael's words struck a nerve. Mr. Carter flinched visibly, opening his mouth as if to respond, but hesitating when he glanced at the crowd. Their expectant eyes made it clear that empty platitudes wouldn't suffice. "I take full responsibility for this," Mr. Carter finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll address the situation with the utmost seriousness. Please know, this is not reflective of our standards." Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Your standards," he echoed, his voice low but resonant. "Your standards are reflected in every interaction your guests have with your staff. If this is what happens when you're not watching, I suggest you take a long, hard look at what's happening under your leadership." The words landed heavily, Mr. Carter's face turned a deeper shade of red. His reputation as a capable manager, carefully built on maintaining a veneer of professionalism, was cracking under the weight of Michael's accusations. In the past few weeks, Mr. Carter had suffered major leadership departures. The murmurs among the guests resumed, some nodding in agreement, while others whispered about how the hotel's reputation was now in jeopardy. Mr. Carter could feel their judgment bearing down on him. This wasn't just about appeasing one guest. It was about salvaging the integrity of the Opal Grand in front of an audience that wouldn't soon forget what they had witnessed. The murmurs among the guests were now soon forget what they had witnessed. "Rest assured, Mr. Walker," Mr. Carter said, his tone shifting to one of determined contrition, "there will be immediate changes. The staff involved will face disciplinary action, and I will personally ensure our training programs are revised to prevent anything like this from happening again." Michael didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of the manager's words settle over the room. Finally, he spoke, his tone cool but less cutting. "Words are easy, Mr. Carter. Actions require commitment. I hope you understand the difference." "I do," Mr. Carter replied quickly, nodding as though his career depended on it. "I give you my word." Turning to the staff, the manager's expression hardened as he addressed them. "Tom, Anna," he said sharply, his voice regaining some of the authority he had momentarily lost. "You will report to my office immediately after this. We'll discuss the consequences of your actions." Tom looked as though he might faint, his earlier arrogance now entirely replaced by dread. Anna, though equally pale, nodded meekly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Michael glanced at the gathered guests, their eyes still fixed on him. Addressing the room, he said, "You all witnessed this. I'm not here to embarrass anyone or seek revenge. What happened today reflects a larger problem, one that needs to be addressed, not ignored." The crowd nodded in agreement, with a few guests even clapping softly in support. Sensing an opportunity to regain control, Mr. Carter cleared his throat. "We deeply value your feedback," he said to the room, "and I assure you, we'll work tirelessly to restore your faith in us." As murmurs of approval rippled through the guests, Michael gave Mr. Carter a final look, one that conveyed both expectation and challenge. The manager nodded in return, understanding this wasn't just a public relations crisis, it was a defining moment for his leadership. Michael shifted his focus to Tom and Anna, the two employees at the center of the ordeal. The tension in the room thickened as the attention turned squarely to them. Tom's face was pale, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Anna stood rigid, her eyes cast downward, guilt written across her features. The weight of accountability was now squarely on their shoulders. "You didn't just disrespect me," Michael began, his voice calm yet resolute. "You disrespected every guest who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who belongs here." His words cut through the air, deliberate and unyielding. Tom's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, the gravity of the situation finally breaking him. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked up at Michael, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry," he stammered. "Please don't fire me. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." The crowd murmured, some expressing sympathy while others shook their heads in disapproval. Anna remained silent, though her face betrayed her inner turmoil. She seemed to want to speak, but was uncertain how to begin. Michael's expression remained composed yet stern. "Respect," he said firmly, "isn't about knowing someone's name or position. It's about recognizing their humanity. That's the bare minimum, and today, both of you failed to meet even that." Jane reached out and put her hand on Michael's arm, but then turned to look out the window. Anna finally looked up, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," she said softly, regret evident in her tone. I should have said something. I knew it wasn't right, but I stayed quiet." I sighed and sat down. Michael's gaze softened slightly as he addressed her. "Silence can be just as harmful as words, Anna. When you choose to stay quiet in the face of wrongdoing, you're choosing to be complicit. Avoiding harm isn't enough. You have to stand against it. Anna nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I understand, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Michael took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle. He wasn't here to destroy careers or humiliate anyone. He was here to drive change. Apologies are a start, he said, his tone measured. But actions are what matter. If you're truly sorry, show it. Not just to me, but to every guest who walks through those doors. Tom wiped his eyes, nodding fervently. I will, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do better, I promise. Michael stepped back, giving them space to process the weight of their actions. Turning to Mr. Carter, who stood nearby, visibly uneasy, he said, This isn't just about these 2 employees. It's about the culture you've allowed to take root here. If you want this hotel to thrive, you need to lead by example, and that starts with holding people accountable, including yourself. Mr. Carter nodded quickly, his expression earnest. You're absolutely right, Mr. Walker, he said. We'll conduct a full review of our policies and training programs. I'll personally ensure every member of this team understands the importance of treating every guest with respect and dignity. Michael gave a slight nod, acknowledging the manager's commitment, but making it clear that promises alone weren't enough. I'll be following up, he said firmly. This is your chance to show that you mean what you say. The murmurs among the crowd shifted, their tone moving from criticism to cautious optimism. A few guests clapped softly, signaling a glimmer of hope that change might come. Tom and Anna, still visibly shaken, exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shame and determination. Michael's words had struck a chord, and it was clear the experience had left a lasting impression. Turning to the gathered guests, Michael addressed them directly. Thank you, he said, his voice warm but resolute. Thank you for speaking up and for holding this establishment accountable. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes all of us standing together to demand better. With that in mind, Michael looked to the guests and said, We really appreciate you joining us today. The crowd responded with a mix of applause and nods, their earlier frustration giving way to a sense of shared purpose. As the energy in the room began to shift, Michael allowed himself a moment of reflection. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much-needed transformation. For Tom and Anna, redemption wouldn't come easily. It would require time, effort, and a genuine commitment to change. For Mr. Carter, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that leadership is more than maintaining appearances. It's about fostering a culture of integrity and respect. And for Michael, it reaffirmed his father's words. You may not change everyone, but you must be the one to start. Today, he had taken another step in that journey, with ripples that would extend far beyond the walls of the Opal Grand. Michael turned back to the crowd, his steady posture conveying the weight of the moment. The lobby, now quieter, buzzed with anticipation. Every eye was on him, staff and guests alike, waiting for his next words. This wasn't just about addressing a wrong, it was an opportunity to make a lasting point. He began with calm authority, his voice resonating across the space. Today, he said, I was treated as if I didn't deserve to step into the very place I own. But I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to ensure this never happens again. The room remained silent, his words sinking in. He paused briefly before continuing. This hotel was built on principles of excellence, service, and respect. Every guest who walks through these doors, no matter how they look or what they wear, deserves to feel welcomed, valued, and treated with dignity. That's the foundation of hospitality. Today, that foundation was tested, and it failed. Michael's gaze shifted to the staff. To those of you who stood by or participated in what happened, let this be a wake-up call. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place here. This isn't just a workplace, it's a reflection of the values we uphold. If those values don't align with yours, this isn't the place for you." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, but Michael pressed on, his voice unwavering. "I'm not here to point fingers without offering solutions. Change starts with acknowledgement, but it takes action to take root. From this moment forward, we're raising the bar. There will be new training, new accountability measures, and higher expectations for every team member, including management. You'll be taught how to stay in control, to call out waste, and to deal with the problem in real time." He turned to Mr. Carter, his expression firm. "Leadership isn't about wearing a title. It's about setting the tone, leading by example, and ensuring every member of your team understands what's expected. I'll be holding you to that standard." Mr. Carter nodded solemnly, his earlier discomfort replaced by a sense of resolve. Michael's words weren't just a reprimand, they were a challenge to rise to the occasion. Michael addressed the guests once more. "To those of you who witnessed what happened here today, thank you for speaking out. Accountability doesn't happen in a vacuum. Your willingness to demand better is what drives change, and I promise you, change is coming." The room was still, the gravity of his statement lingering. Then, a few guests began to clap, their applause growing until it filled the space. The sound wasn't just approval, it was an acknowledgement of a shared moment, a collective understanding that something important had taken place. As the applause faded, Michael delivered one final statement, his tone resolute, yet hopeful. "This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter for this hotel. A chapter defined by respect, integrity, and excellence. That's the standard we'll uphold, and I invite all of you to hold us to it." With that, he stepped back, allowing the room to absorb the moment. The faces around him reflected a mix of emotions, some inspired, others contemplative, but all affected. This wasn't just a speech, it was a turning point, one that would ripple through the Opal Grand and beyond. The events in the lobby left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Guests dispersed, their conversations buzzing with the weight of what they had witnessed. Some expressed gratitude for Michael's courage, while others speculated on how the hotel would handle the fallout. For the staff, a quiet reckoning hung in the air, lingering like a shadow. Tom, pale and slumped in a chair, sat alone in the employee lounge. His termination had been swift and public, leaving no doubt about the consequences of his actions. He stared at the floor, replaying the moment Michael revealed his ownership. The humiliation was crushing, but what gnawed at him wasn't the loss of his job. It was the realization of who he had become. "I didn't just lose my job," he muttered to no one. "I lost the chance to be better." Memories flooded his mind, moments when he had judged, dismissed, or made assumptions without a second thought. These behaviors had been so ingrained that he hadn't questioned them. Until now. The shame he felt wasn't confined to the day's events. It was rooted in the patterns he had allowed to define him. Stripped of his position and its false authority, Tom was left to confront himself. Anna, still employed but visibly shaken, sat at her desk, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake Michael's words about silence being as harmful as action. Her complicity in allowing Tom's behavior to go unchecked weighed heavily on her. Staring blankly at her screen, she resolved to do better, not just at work but in every part of her life. If nothing else, she owed Michael that much. In the executive suite, Michael stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the city lights. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation had faded, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, not as regret, but as the familiar burden of responsibility. Behind him, Leah's voice broke the silence. "You did the right thing," she said softly, her tone reassuring as she placed a hand on his back. "You stood up not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been judged unfairly. You did that better than I ever would." She smiled. Michael turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "It shouldn't take something like this to make people see," he said, frustration lacing his words. "It shouldn't take humiliation for change to happen." Leah nodded, her gaze steady. You're right, but sometimes change starts with a single moment. And today, you gave everyone in that lobby something they won't forget." Her words eased the tension in his chest. She was right. The events of the day, though painful, had been necessary. They forced a reckoning, not just for Tom and Anna, but for the staff, the guests, and even himself. The hotel's leadership, led by Mr. Carter, was already working to address the fallout. Emails were sent, meetings scheduled, and a public statement drafted to acknowledge the incident and promise immediate reforms. Training sessions on unconscious bias and hospitality standards were set to begin within the week. Michael made it clear he would personally oversee the changes, ensuring they were genuine efforts to rebuild trust and integrity, not mere gestures. As the night deepened, Michael allowed himself a moment of reflection. His father's words echoed in his mind, a steady reminder of the principles that guided him. You can't fix what you don't see, but when you see it, don't look away. And I found the more I do exercise, the more I'm able to find my strength, said Daniel Longus. He had seen the cracks, and he hadn't looked away. But the work was far from over. This was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the Opal Grand began to change. The incident became a catalyst for transformation, sparking conversations about accountability, respect, and the true meaning of hospitality. Some staff chose to leave, unwilling or unable to embrace the new standards. Others, like Anna, stayed, determined to learn and grow. For Tom, losing his job was a painful but necessary wake-up call. He spent countless hours reflecting on his actions, vowing to learn from his mistakes. Redemption wouldn't come quickly or easily, but he was determined to earn it. One small step at a time. For Michael, the events of that day reaffirmed his mission, not just as a hotel owner, but as a leader. Change wasn't easy, nor was it always welcome, but it was necessary. As he stood at the window of his suite, the city lights sprawled before him like a living canvas. He resolved to continue the work his father had begun. His legacy would be defined not by appearances, but by principles. The city hummed with life below, each flickering light and shadowed street holding a story of its own. But tonight, Michael's thoughts weren't on the city. They were on the lessons the day had revealed and the path it illuminated. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, his voice steady yet resolute. The weight of his resolve pressed against him, not as a burden, but as a calling. The incident at the Opal Grand wasn't an isolated event. It reflected deeper issues within the hospitality industry and society as a whole. Snap judgments, unchecked biases, and the dismissal of humanity in favor of appearances. These were the cracks in the foundation he was determined to address. He envisioned a culture where respect wasn't conditional, where every guest, employee, and individual felt valued, not because of their wealth, attire, or status, but because they were human. It wasn't just about fixing one hotel, it was about redefining what hospitality truly meant. Michael's thoughts turned to his father, whose values had shaped his own. His father often spoke of fairness, not as an abstract ideal, but as a principle to live by, a force capable of transforming businesses and lives. Fairness isn't a strategy, his father had once said. It's a responsibility. Now Michael felt that responsibility more deeply than ever. He saw the steps ahead, training programs that would go beyond customer service to include empathy, unconscious bias, and the impact of everyday actions. Hiring practices that prioritized values as much as skills. And leadership accountability not just for results, but for the culture they cultivated. He imagined a hotel where guests from all walks of life felt genuinely welcomed, where every staff member took pride in their work, knowing they were part of something meaningful. A place where no one, no matter how they looked, would ever feel dismissed or invisible. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Resistance would come from those clinging to the comfort of the status quo or dismissing his vision as idealistic. But as he looked out over the city, Michael welcomed the challenge. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. A faint knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Leah entered, her warm presence grounding him. She walked to his side, following his gaze to the lights below. "Thinking about today?" she asked softly. Michael nodded. "It shouldn't take something like this to make people see," he said, frustration lacing his tone. "It shouldn't take humiliation for change to happen. They just need the right." Leah placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You're right, but sometimes change starts with a single moment. Today, you gave everyone something they won't forget." Her words settled over him, easing the tension in his chest. She was right. The day had been difficult, but it had been necessary. It forced a reckoning, not just for the staff, but for the guests and himself. The hotel's leadership, led by Mr. Carter, was already moving to address the fallout. Emails had been sent, meetings scheduled, and a public statement drafted, acknowledging the incident and promising immediate reforms. Training sessions on unconscious bias and hospitality standards would begin within the week. Michael had made it clear he would personally oversee the changes, ensuring they weren't performative but meaningful. As the night deepened, Michael allowed himself one last moment of reflection. His father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and unwavering. "You can't fix what you don't see, but when you see it, don't look away." Michael nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "And tomorrow," he said, "and every day after that." He hesitated. Leah reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're building something that matters," she said. "Not just for this hotel, but for everyone who crosses its path. That's how legacies are made." Her words lingered in his mind as the night deepened. This wasn't just about leaving a legacy. It was about creating something lasting, something others could carry forward. A culture of fairness and dignity wasn't built overnight, but with time, persistence, and the right people, it could take root and flourish. As the city settled into its quieter rhythms, Michael felt a rare sense of calm. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained, etched into the fabric of the Opal Grand and the people who had witnessed it. The hotel would never be the same, and neither would he. With one last glance at the city lights, he turned away from the window, a renewed sense of purpose filling him. Tomorrow, the work would continue. The road ahead would be long, but every step would bring him closer to the vision he held. A world where respect and fairness weren't exceptions, but the rule. A world he was determined to help create. As he closed his eyes that night, his father's words echoed in his mind. "You may not change everyone, but you must be the one to start." Michael smiled faintly in the darkness. He had started, and for now, that was enough.